Excluded from my cousin's wedding to avoid drama, I took a vacation. When the wedding turned into a disaster, my family begged for my help. "You need to help pay for this." I, 32M, never thought my own family would throw me under the bus for the sake of keeping the peace. But here we are. What started as being excluded from my cousin's wedding turned into the most satisfying revenge I've ever witnessed unfold naturally. My cousin Sarah has always been the golden child of our extended family. 3 years older than me, she's had everything handed to her since we were kids. When she announced her engagement to some guy she'd been dating for 8 months, the entire family acted like it was the wedding of the century. The budget was astronomical. We're talking $80,000 for a single day, funded mostly by her parents, but with contributions expected from the entire extended family. The drama started 2 months before the wedding when Sarah's future mother-in-law made some comment about not wanting certain family members at the wedding because they might cause problems. She was referring to me, apparently, because I'd had the audacity to question some of Sarah's life choices in the past. Nothing major, just pointing out when she was being irresponsible with money or treating people poorly. But somehow, this translated to me being a negative influence who would ruin the vibe of her special day. Instead of standing up for me, my aunt and uncle, Sarah's parents, decided it would be easier to uninvite me. They called it avoiding unnecessary drama. My own parents, who I thought would have my back, suggested I just go along with it to keep family harmony. The betrayal cut deep, but what really got to me was how they still expected me to contribute financially to this wedding I wasn't even invited to attend. My aunt cornered me at a family barbecue, explaining how they really needed everyone to chip in because the costs were getting out of hand. She had the nerve to ask for $2,000 from me, money I'd been saving for months for a vacation I'd been planning. When I told her I wouldn't be contributing to a wedding I wasn't welcome at, she acted like I was being petty and selfish. That's when I decided to take my vacation during the exact week of Sarah's wedding. I booked a trip to Costa Rica, something I'd been dreaming about for years. Zip-lining through cloud forests, surfing lessons, wildlife photography, the works. I made sure to post about my planning on social media, not to be spiteful, but because I was genuinely excited about this adventure. The family's reaction was immediate and predictable. My phone buzzed constantly with messages about how I was being deliberately difficult and trying to steal attention from Sarah's big day. My mother called me 3 times in one evening, begging me to reconsider both the trip and my refusal to contribute money. She kept saying I was making this about myself when all I was doing was living my life. I left for Costa Rica the day before the wedding, and it was everything I'd hoped for. The first few days were incredible. I was hiking through Manuel Antonio National Park, learning to surf in Tamarindo, and completely disconnecting from the family drama back home. I turned off most of my notifications and was just enjoying the freedom of being somewhere beautiful where nobody expected anything from me. Then, on day 4 of my trip, while I was having breakfast at a beachside cafe, my phone started exploding with missed calls and messages. Something had gone very, very wrong with the wedding. The first message I saw was from my cousin Jake, Sarah's brother, and it was just 3 words: "Wedding is ruined." My stomach dropped as I scrolled through increasingly frantic messages from various family members. Apparently, the wedding had turned into an absolute disaster, and now everyone was in full panic mode. Here's what had happened. Sarah's new husband had a secret gambling addiction that nobody knew about. 3 days before the wedding, he'd taken the money they'd saved for their honeymoon, about $15,000, and lost it all in a single night at a casino. But it gets worse. He'd also been lying about his job. He'd been fired 6 months earlier and had been pretending to go to work every day, racking up credit card debt to maintain the illusion. The truth came out during the rehearsal dinner when his former boss showed up, apparently having tracked him down about some missing company equipment. The confrontation happened right there in front of both families, with his ex-boss demanding to know why he'd been ignoring calls about returning a company laptop and some expensive software licenses. Sarah was mortified, but she decided to go through with the wedding anyway, thinking they could work through it. Big mistake. During the reception, while everyone was eating dinner, 2 men in suits showed up with legal papers. Turns out, her new husband owed money to some very serious people, not just the casino, but loan sharks he'd borrowed from to try to win back his losses. The men weren't violent or threatening, but they made it clear that the debt was now Sarah's problem too. since they were legally married. They wanted $35,000 immediately, or they'd be taking legal action to seize assets. The whole reception ground to a halt as these debt collectors explained the situation to a room full of wedding guests. But the absolute worst part was still coming. In desperation, Sarah's new husband had forged her signature on a loan application using her parents' house as collateral. He'd borrowed another $20,000 against their property without anyone knowing, and that payment was already overdue. The wedding reception turned into a crisis management meeting. Sarah was crying. Her parents were furious, and the groom just kept apologizing and promising he could fix everything. Half the guests left early, and the other half stayed to watch the drama unfold like it was a reality TV show. My phone kept buzzing with updates throughout the day. My aunt was having a breakdown because she might lose her house. My uncle was talking about pressing charges against his new son-in-law. Sarah was alternating between defending her husband and threatening to get the marriage annulled immediately. Then came the calls asking for my help. First, it was my mother, explaining the situation and asking if I could come home early to help the family figure out what to do. When I reminded her that I'd been uninvited from this wedding specifically to avoid drama, she got quiet for a moment before saying that this was different and family needed to stick together. Next was my aunt, calling me directly and sobbing into the phone about how they needed money to pay off the debts before they lost their house. She asked if I could loan them the $2,000 they'd originally wanted for the wedding, plus anything else I could spare. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same money they demanded for a wedding I couldn't attend was now desperately needed to clean up the mess that wedding had created. My uncle called an hour later with a different approach. He tried to guilt me by saying I was the only family member with savings who could help them through this crisis. He reminded me of all the times they'd helped me over the years, and how this was my chance to pay that back. When I pointed out that they'd literally excluded me from the family event that caused this problem, he got defensive and said I was holding grudges at the worst possible time. Even Sarah herself called me, which was surprising since we'd barely spoken in months. She was crying and apologetic, admitting that excluding me from the wedding had been wrong, but begging me to help them anyway. She kept saying she didn't know what else to do, and that I was the only person who might have enough money to help solve this. The most frustrating call came from my father, who tried to take a logical approach. He explained that while the situation was complicated, the family needed to come together to solve it. He suggested I could cut my vacation short, come home, and help them figure out a payment plan with the creditors. When I asked why I should give up my vacation to solve a problem created by a wedding I wasn't allowed to attend, he said I was being stubborn and making this about my hurt feelings. Here's the thing. I wasn't unsympathetic to their situation. What happened to Sarah was genuinely awful, and I wouldn't wish that kind of betrayal on anyone. But the complete lack of self-awareness from my family was staggering. They'd excluded me, dismissed my feelings, demanded my money, and then expected me to drop everything to bail them out when their perfect wedding turned into a nightmare. I spent a day thinking about it while zip-lining through the cloud forest. Hanging suspended above the canopy, with nothing but the sound of howler monkeys and tropical birds, I gained some clarity about the situation. My family had made their choice when they decided I wasn't worth including. Now they were facing the consequences of that choice, and it wasn't my responsibility to fix it. I called my mother back that evening and told her I wouldn't be cutting my vacation short or contributing money to solve this crisis. I explained that I sympathized with what Sarah was going through, but that the family had made it clear I wasn't really part of their important decisions. If I wasn't good enough to be included in the celebration, I wasn't obligated to help with the cleanup. The reaction was immediate and explosive. My mother accused me of being heartless and vindictive. My aunt called me selfish and said I was abandoning the family when they needed me most. Even my cousin Jake, who I'd always gotten along with, sent me a long text about how disappointed he was in my response. But here's what really sealed my decision. My uncle called me one more time, and instead of apologizing for how they'd treated me, he tried to blame me for the whole situation. He said that if I'd just contributed the money they'd asked for originally, they wouldn't have had to rely so heavily on the groom's contributions, and maybe they would have discovered his lies earlier. Somehow, in his mind, my refusal to pay for a wedding I wasn't invited to had contributed to the disaster. That's when I realized this wasn't really about the money at all. This was about control and expectations. My family expected me to be available for their needs while being excluded from their lives. They wanted my financial support without my actual presence, my help without my input, my loyalty without their respect. I finished my vacation in Costa Rica, posting pictures of beautiful sunsets and wildlife adventures while my phone continued to buzz with increasingly desperate messages from home. I learned to surf, hiked through national parks, and had some of the best meals of my life. Meanwhile, the family crisis continued to unfold back home. Update 1. I returned from Costa Rica to find the family situation had somehow gotten even worse. Sarah had decided to stay married to her husband, convinced she could help him overcome his gambling addiction. Her parents were furious about this decision, especially since it meant they were still on the hook for the forged loan against their house. The debt collectors had been surprisingly patient, agreeing to a payment plan, but it required immediate partial payment of $10,000 to show good faith. My aunt and uncle had been scrambling to raise this money, asking every family member and friend they could think of. They'd managed to collect about $6,000, but were still short. When I showed up at the family barbecue the weekend after I got back, the atmosphere was tense. People were polite to me, but I could feel the resentment. My cousin Jake pulled me aside and asked one more time if I'd reconsider helping with the money. When I said no, he shook his head and said he didn't understand how I could watch the family struggle like this. That's when my aunt overheard and decided to confront me directly in front of everyone. She stood up at the picnic table and announced loudly that she couldn't believe I was willing to let them lose their house over petty hurt feelings. She said I was being cruel and selfish, and that she'd never expected this kind of behavior from family. The whole barbecue went quiet, and I realized this was my moment. I stood up and calmly explained to everyone exactly what had happened. I reminded them that I'd been excluded from the wedding specifically to avoid drama. I pointed out that they'd still expected me to contribute $2,000 to an event I wasn't allowed to attend. I explained that I'd used that money for a vacation instead, which was exactly what I'd told them I was going to do. Then I asked the question that nobody wanted to answer. If I wasn't important enough to be included in the family celebration, why was I suddenly essential for the family crisis? I pointed out that they couldn't have it both ways. Either I was part of the family or I wasn't. The silence that followed was deafening. My mother tried to interrupt, saying this wasn't the time or place for this discussion, but I wasn't finished. I told them that I'd learned something important during my vacation. I didn't need their approval or inclusion to be happy. I'd had an amazing time in Costa Rica, and I'd realized that I'd been trying too hard to maintain relationships with people who only valued me when they needed something. My uncle tried to argue that family was supposed to help each other regardless of past disagreements, but I shut that down quickly. I reminded him that when I'd needed their support, when I was being excluded and hurt, they'd told me to just go along with it for the sake of harmony. Now that they needed my support, suddenly family loyalty was the most important thing in the world. Update 2. The confrontation at the barbecue changed everything. Word spread quickly through the extended family about what had happened, and opinions were divided. Some relatives reached out to me privately, admitting they thought I'd been treated unfairly but hadn't wanted to get involved. Others doubled down on the idea that I should help regardless of how I'd been treated. Sarah's situation continued to deteriorate. Her husband had promised to get help for his gambling addiction, but within 2 weeks of the wedding, he'd disappeared for 3 days and come back having lost another $5,000. Money Sarah had given him from her own savings to help pay bills. She finally filed for separation and moved back in with her parents. The irony was thick. Sarah's parents now had their daughter back home, dealing with the aftermath of the marriage they'd spent $80,000 celebrating, while still facing the possibility of losing their house due to the forged loan. The son-in-law they'd welcomed into the family had vanished, leaving behind only debt and legal problems. My aunt made one final attempt to get money from me, this time taking a different approach. She came to my apartment alone, without the rest of the family, and tried to appeal to me personally. She apologized for how I'd been treated regarding the wedding, admitting it had been wrong to exclude me. She said she understood why I was hurt and angry, but begged me to consider helping anyway, just this once. I listened to her whole speech, and I could see she was genuinely desperate. But then she said something that revealed she still didn't really understand the situation. She told me that if I helped them this time, she'd make sure I was included in all future family events. She was essentially offering to treat me like family in exchange for my money. I explained to her that being treated like family shouldn't be conditional on my financial contributions. I told her that the damage had already been done, not just by excluding me from the wedding, but by the family's response to this crisis. The fact that they'd only reconsidered my value to the family when they needed money showed me exactly where I stood. She left my apartment crying, and I felt bad about that. But I also felt something I hadn't felt in months: peace. I'd finally stopped trying to earn my place in a family that had already decided I was expendable. Update 3. 6 months later, the dust has finally settled, and the aftermath is exactly what you'd expect. My aunt and uncle managed to avoid losing their house, but just barely. They had to take out a second mortgage and will be paying for Sarah's wedding disaster for the next 15 years. Sarah got her marriage annulled and is slowly rebuilding her life, though she's moved to a different city to start fresh. The family dynamics have permanently shifted. There's a clear divide between those who supported me and those who still think I should have helped regardless of how I was treated. Family gatherings are awkward now, with people choosing sides and avoiding certain topics. But here's the surprising part. I'm happier than I've been in years. Removing myself from the family drama and expectations has been incredibly liberating. I've used the money I saved by not contributing to the wedding to take 2 more amazing trips, one to New Zealand and another to Iceland. I've also started dating someone who actually appreciates me for who I am, not what I can provide. My mother still calls occasionally, usually when there's some new family crisis that requires money or support. She's learned not to ask me directly, but she'll mention how stressed everyone is and how much they could use help. I listen politely and then change the subject. Sarah reached out to me recently, sending a long message apologizing for everything that happened. She admitted that excluding me from the wedding had been wrong, and that she understood why I'd refused to help with the aftermath. She said she didn't expect forgiveness, but wanted me to know that she'd learned from the experience. I appreciated her message, and I wrote back telling her I hoped she was doing well in her new city. But I didn't offer to rebuild our relationship or pretend that everything was fine now. Some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt, and sometimes that's for the best. The most satisfying part of this whole experience wasn't the revenge. It was the realization that I didn't need these people's approval to be happy. They'd excluded me from their celebration, and in doing so, they'd freed me from their expectations. Their wedding disaster wasn't my fault, and their financial crisis wasn't my responsibility. I learned that sometimes the best response to being excluded is to stay excluded. They wanted me gone when things were good, so I stayed gone when things got bad. And honestly, my life has been much better without the constant drama and manipulation. The family still talks about the wedding disaster, and my name still comes up in those conversations. But now I'm the one who got away, who chose his own happiness over family obligation. And every time I look at the photos from my Costa Rica trip or plan my next adventure, I'm reminded that sometimes the best revenge is simply living well.